We actually have a line that we do at our house. We practice this thing. What is it?
I'm Ariel Sky Williams. I'm 8 years old. I'm unarmed and I have nothing that will hurt you.
It's just kind of a thing we practice at our house. There are great police officers out there. There's also some police officers who are not so good.
And my fear is that you run across one of those bad ones.
For some reason, people of color have always been a target by the police.
Before they became a policeman, they were a person. And that person took all their ideas and all their thoughts and all their prejudice into their job.
Why would a police officer assume that you did something bad?
Maybe because of my skin color.
I remember being put in handcuffs for something that had nothing to do with me. I was literally walking in the mall. Cops slammed me on the ground, busted my lip, chipped my tooth. That actually made me really mad.
How about the time they pulled us over with me in the car and arrested me and left all of you guys sitting in the car, nobody knew how to drive on the side of the road because the bumper on the car was kind of hanging off?
No.
You know, we live in Puyallup. There's people that don't even have a bumper on their car.
My rear brake light wasn't working, and I got to my destination and they were working.
I was about your age, actually. They grabbed me.
Why?
I didn't know at the time. They just grabbed me. They threw me onto the police car.
I got tased that time. That time they tased me because they said I wasn't complying.
Ariel, are you okay?
What's wrong, baby? I'm okay, I'm alive, all right? Every day I get to see you, I get to do this, right? All right, come on, let's calm down, let's finish this, all right? You good? Hey, you making me cry. Come on.
You have to be careful when you're out there in this world because this world's not gonna always be honest or fair to you. I know, Sean, you got a little bit lighter than the rest of them, so it's a possibility you won't get stopped.
Sound like you just pulled him over.
Okay. If you're driving, cop pulls you over.
Police gets out the car, comes to the window, what would you do?
License and registration, please, ma'am.
Why do you think I pulled you over?
I don't know, tell me.
When a police officer says something to you, you're black. You can't be looking at them saying, oh, I don't know, why don't you tell me?
Well, I mean,
that right there is giving them the license to pull you out of your car and physically harm you because it will be done.
Don't get upset, don't get sassy. Why did you pull me over? You don't have, I know how, just follow instructions and stay calm.
Okay.
Do you think just being a police officer and pulling you over, regardless of if you feel you've done something or not, they should get your respect?
That's a tricky question.
The answer is yes.
Yes. If you gotta go to your wallet to get your ID, say, can I go reach in my back pocket to get my ID out?
You could do what I do and I show them my hands, so when they're walking up, they see I don't have anything in my hands.
I'm Ariel Sky Williams, and I have nothing that will harm you or hurt you.
And what's the next place you put your hands when you're driving or on the steering wheel with your hands out?
If at all possible, turn your phone on.
And call someone and put it on speaker.
But whatever you're doing, I want you to say what you're doing before you do it.
You don't write any statements.
Well, you have to write a statement.
You don't have to write anything. You're a minor. I'm responsible for you. No one can tell you anything else.
If it tells you to be quiet, do everything that you can to get back to me. I see it weighing on you, and I don't want it to weigh on you.
I'm just worried about Donovan. I'm worried about him now.
Who are you guys talking about?
My nephew and her cousin.
I don't want him to be shot. I don't want him to go to jail.
You guys, if you could say anything to police, what would you say?
Learn about people, learn about their problems.
Take some diversity training. I mean, it should be like at this point, like a monthly requirement.
You know, there's really nothing at this point that they could do that would make me feel any safer with them without them just point blank, clearing them all out and starting all over from scratch.
So don't always assume that all of them are bad.
But all you see on the news and in newspapers, and it keeps happening. It's just in a different way. It's like how people are like, you should forgive so-and-so, but they keep doing it to me. I forgave them, but they keep doing it to me. It gets harder and harder to forgive them.
Wow.
Hello and welcome to MSG's webinar addressing anti-Blackness as Koreans and Korean Americans.
안녕하세요. 한국계 미국인으로서 반흑인주의에 대한 대안 웨비나에 오신 것을 환영합니다.
My name is Kathy and I have the honor of serving as the CEO of Mustard Seed Generation, and joined with me is my dear sister and our Chief Operating Officer, Ami.
네, 방금 말씀하신 분은 MSG의 CEO 강신혜 씨고요. 저는 강수은 MSG의 COO로 섬기고 있습니다.
And just for this introduction, she will be translating in Korean, as you can already tell, and then later on we will show you how that translation will continue throughout this webinar.
네, 현재로서 제가 통역하고 있지만 앞으로 어떻게 저희가 번역을 제공할지 알려드리겠습니다.
So Mustard Seed Generation is a nonprofit dedicated to creating spaces like this, conversations that we can have parent to child. And although the nature of our conversation cannot even compare to the nature of the conversation that we've seen in the Black community and in the conversations that took place in that video, we hope that this will be small steps for us to talk about this really important issue today.
네, 방금 보신 비디오에 흑인 커뮤니티가 다루는 정말 중요한 대화들을 보셨는데요. 저희가 그렇게 무겁고 무거운 주제를 다루진 않겠지만 이 공간 또한 부모들과 자녀들이 서로 소통하는 공간이었으면 좋겠습니다.
And there's obviously so much to talk about. This is a very complex topic, but with this limited time, we do want to just state that while we will mention some Korean history involved to talk about anti-Blackness, we will be focusing on the US context as Koreans and Korean Americans who are living in American soil.
네, 그리고 저희가 반흑인주의에 대한 대안을 다루면서 물론 한국 역사를 조금씩은 언급을 하겠지만 주로 미국 상황과 미국에 살고 계신 한국인들을 위한 자료들을 주로 포커스를 두겠습니다.
We also want to mention that there are many other platforms out there where there's interdialogue with Korean, Asian communities, as well as the Black community. Today, we will make sure to link those resources so you can listen in on those conversations. However, for this time, we are excited to create a space where a pretty rare space where Koreans and Korean Americans can specifically dialogue together.
네, 다른 플랫폼을 통해서 동양인, 에이전 아메리칸들과 흑인 커뮤니티를 주제로 삼은 다른 자료들이 제공되고 있음을 저희가 잘 알고 있습니다. 그런 자료들을 저희가 이 웨비나가 끝나고 꼭 쉐어를 하기 원하는데요. 지금 현재 이 웨비나는 한국인들을 위한 공간이라는 그런 특별한 점이 있는 것 같습니다.
We do want to just acknowledge that for this conversation to take place with our parents and our children and our grandparents, perhaps, we have an incredible translation team who are volunteering their time from all across the country to be able to support with this. So we want to just give a quick shout out to our wonderful translation team who will be working behind the scenes.
네, 저희 가족분 여러분들께서 모두 같이 이 웨비나에 참석하기 위해서 한국어 자막이 제공되고 있습니다. 그러기 위해서 미국 곳곳에서 지금 여러분들께서 자원하고 계시는데요. 그분들에게 꼭 감사의 말씀을 전하고 싶습니다.
They worked very hard this weekend, so please root for them as they continue with translations today. It's hard work. For translation today, we want to make sure that you're able to do this and tune in with whoever you're tuning in with, that it's accessible by everyone. And so we actually would encourage you in the chat box right now, we will be linking a translation document that you can click on. And this is the format that we find to be most beneficial, just to have a side-by-side panelist and document presented on the screen. That will be most helpful for you today.
네, 지금 줌 대화창을 보시면 링크가 올라와 있을 겁니다. 거기 링크를 누르시면 번역이 제공되는 구글 닥을 액세스하실 수 있습니다. 이렇게 스크린으로 보이시는 것처럼 분할 화면으로 하시면 조금 더 쉽게 보실 수 있습니다.
Great, awesome. And because it's a webinar, we want to just make sure that we go over some technical aspects. One is, throughout the conversation, you are definitely probably going to have some resources that you want to share with the community, and we welcome that. However, because messages will make it really hard to keep track of the resources, what we will do is share a link at the very end of this webinar where anyone attending this session could drop in any resources that they want to share with the community. So please hold on to your resources and make sure you add that to the document at the end of the webinar. And second, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please use that. That's really going to drive the conversation for our panelists. And there's an option to post anonymously if that is important to you. And for our attendees, if you don't have questions, but you see a question that really is salient to you, please put a thumbs up. That way it'll help our wonderful moderator be able to prioritize those questions.
네, 저희 참석자분들께서도 많은 좋은 자료들이 있을 거라고 저희가 생각합니다. 웨비나 도중에 쉐어하고 싶을 수도 있겠지만 그러면 저희 대화창에 메시지들이 너무 많아질 것 같아요. 그래서 저희가 웨비나 끝에 구글 닥을 쉐어할 건데요. 거기에 누구나 자료들을 쉐어할 수 있습니다. 그래서 그때까지만 조금 참아주시면 저희 웨비나를 조금 더 잘할 수 있을 것 같습니다. 또 저희 웨비나의 질문들이, 참석자분들의 질문들이 참 중요한데요. 줌 화면 밑에 보시면 Q&A 버튼이 있습니다. 거기를 누르시면 익명으로라도 질문을 하실 수 있는데요. 그렇게 많이들 해주시길 바라고, 또 공감이 되는 질문이나 정말 중요하다고 생각하시는 질문이 있으면 라이크를 해주시면 저희 진행자분께서 어떤 질문들이 제일 중요한지 잘 아실 수 있을 것 같습니다.
Wonderful. And right now we are actually, Ami, we are at 350 attendees right now, which is
wow,
so exciting. We're so glad that you are here, and we would love to get to know you a little bit more. And so we're going to begin our conversation with 5 poll questions. We'll go through it pretty quickly so we could get to the conversation, but we think this is really important to know who we're conversing with today. So if we could put the first question up, we would love for you to share with us where you're tuning in from today. And so,
네, 저희가 지금 350명이 넘게 지금 참석자분들이 계신다고 하는데요. 저희가 참석자분들을 조금 더 알아가기 위해서 설문조사를 하고 있습니다. 첫 번째 질문은 어느 지역에서 참석하고 계시는지에 대한 질문입니다.
So maybe we can use this time to ask while everyone's putting their answer in. Ami, where are you tuning in from today?
Kathy, I am tuning in from Boston, Massachusetts. 저는 보스턴에 지금 있고요. Where are you at, Kathy?
저는 지금 Dallas에서 진행하고 있습니다. So I am in Dallas, actually specifically Carrollton. There are a lot of Korean people in this area.
거기는 날씨가 어떤가요?
It's very hot. So looking at the results, wow, a lot of people from the Northeast, but what's amazing is that there's someone from every corner, it looks like.
북동부 쪽에서 많은 분들께서 참석하신 것 같네요. 그래도 미국 곳곳에서 많이 오신 것 같아요.
That's very exciting. Okay, if we could go on to our next poll question, we would love for you to share with us your language preference. And obviously we are providing both, but it would be really great if you could let us know which language you prefer.
네, 저희는 영어, 한국어 둘 다 사용하려고 하지만 참석자분들께서는 영어와 한국어 둘 중에서 더 편한 언어를 선택해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
Great. If we could see the results.
네, 결과는요.
Great. Awesome. We have a lot of bilingual folks too, which is exciting.
영어, 한국어 둘 다 잘하시는 분들이 많으시네요.
Wonderful. Great. The next question that we have is, which generation do you identify with the most?
네, 다음은 보기 중에서 자기가 본인이 해당하시는 것을 선택하시면 될 것 같습니다.
Ami, do you want to share which one you would click?
I mean, I came to the States when I was 2, so probably, 결과가 나온 것 같아요.
Great. Okay. Awesome. Looks like most born and raised in the States, so a lot of second, third plus gens, and as well as a sprinkling of everyone. So we're very glad that you can join us. Okay, our fourth question is really based on the content of today's conversation. And you can pick as many choices as you want that really resonates with you. What brings you to today's session?
네 번째 질문은 이 웨비나에 왜 참석하고 계시는지, 그 이유가 무엇인지 선택하시면 될 것 같고요. 해당되는 것마다 원하시는 만큼 선택하시면 될 것 같습니다.
I feel like I resonate with all of these. I don't know
Yes.
about you.
A lot of learning to do.
Yeah, we are definitely coming in as learners for sure. If we could see the results, that would be so great.
Wow.
Even there's okay, great. Wonderful. Awesome. And our last question is really checking in on you. We really care about our community and what you're bringing into this space. So obviously a lot has been happening with COVID and just everything on the media, and just the fact that our Black community is really going through a very difficult time, and for us to be able to walk alongside them, I know that there's a lot of emotions and we're here for that. And so if you could share with us what feelings are most salient for you right now, that would be so great. So please check off as many that resonate with you as possible.
요즘 많은 일들이 있는데 이 상황 가운데 본인 감정이 어떤 단어로 표현할 수 있는지 선택하시면 될 것 같습니다. And you can check as many as possible for this one too, right?
Yes. If we could see the results.
슬픔이 제일 많네요.
I think especially after watching that video too, I think reality that our brothers and sisters are facing, I think that's really hard. At the same time, we are so grateful to have this space, and without further ado, we want to make sure we move on with introducing our moderator. So I'm very, very excited to introduce our moderator for tonight. And our moderator is Scott Hwang, who's Associate Director of Program on Intergroup Relations at the University of Michigan. And he's also in the dissertation phase of his doctorate at the University of Pittsburgh for education. So we're very excited to have you, Scott. Thank you so much for joining us.
네, 저희 진행자를 소개해드리겠습니다. 스캇 황 씨는 현재 미시간 주립대학교에서 그룹 간 관계 프로그램 부원장으로 일하고 계시고요. University of Pittsburgh에서 박사과정을 마무리 짓고 있다고 합니다. 네, 저희가 너무너무 기대가 됩니다.
Thank you. Take it away, Scott. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, and thank you to our translation team. I'm not bilingual by any means, so I totally appreciate you, and thank you for your work. I'd like to thank the panelists and all the team once again for joining us this evening, and all our attendees. It's such a huge honor to be a part of this and to be able to moderate. I'm gonna introduce our panel. I'll follow the format that Joe used last time. So I'm gonna introduce you, and if you wanna give a wave or some type of acknowledgement, that'd be great. So in no particular order, we're gonna start with Jeanie Chang, clinical medical health counselor at Wheaton College. Is my panelist up? Maybe not. So Jeanie, and then we have Dr. Alexander Jin, professor of higher education at Azusa Pacific University. We have Miss Kathy Khang, speaker and author of Raise Your Voice, Why Stay Silent and How to Speak Up. Then we have Pastor Raymond Chang, president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative and campus minister at Wheaton College. And then we have Dr. Josephine Kim, professor in prevention, science, and practice in counseling programs at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University. So that's our panelists. So I'm going to do a brief intro and frame our conversation. Like I said, I'm excited to be a part of this important discussion. I think we're really doing some groundbreaking work here, particularly with intergenerationally with our Korean Americans and Korean parents. And we're gonna be doing some really difficult conversations that we haven't really addressed, I feel like. So I wanna first acknowledge that we're gonna talk about some really, really deep and painful things that are gonna be close to our heart and close to our experiences. And that's gonna charge us, and that's okay. And I like to use the term charge instead of triggered because of the connotations. So just so you know, that's the term that I'm using. And this is something that typically we don't do as Koreans and Korean Americans, right? We're taught to suppress and hide our feelings. We don't want to address past hurts and wounds, and we simply just move forward. And so to recognize the painful things that are going on is going to be a stretch for some of us in attendance today. So that's going to be huge, and I applaud you for joining us in this conversation. But I think this is really necessary if we want to move forward. So if you think about the human body, physically, if you were physically wounded, you wouldn't simply try to ignore it and move on. If I cut myself, and I'm bleeding, I wouldn't just be like, okay, time to go, right? And so that's not sustainable. So you need to address the wound and try to let it heal. And I don't think we do that well as Koreans and Korean Americans. And so tonight's a chance to do that. And we're gonna address the wounds, and then we're also gonna take the first step in healing. A huge part of this journey too is that we're all learning. All of us, all the panelists, we're continuing to learn. And even though we have certain titles and accomplishments and have studied in certain things, we're never done learning and growing in our understanding of ourselves, of others, and our country's history, particularly the history that's generally not taught to us or it's discussed. So we're gonna learn together. So I don't wanna frame this as we're the experts and we're here to tell you what to do. We're part of the conversation, we're part of the growth, and we're gonna heal together, and we're gonna learn together. And I wanna emphasize that if this is your first time hearing about these concepts in history, that's okay. We're gonna join, please come and join us on this journey of learning and growing together. So I'll end with this analogy. We're on a highway toward reconciliation, and some people might get onto the highway later on in life. That's okay. But today, myself and the panelists, we're gonna try to do our best to build a proper on-ramp for you to get up to speed and learn and grow. And then you're gonna be on this highway with all of us, and we're gonna learn, okay? So I'm gonna encourage our panelists to infuse as much Korean as they are able to. For me, that's gonna be 0 because my Korean is awful. But panelists, as you are able to, if you want to infuse Korean, please do so. All right. So thanks, panelists, for joining us. It's an honor. So I'm gonna jump right in. And the first question we have is, what is anti-Blackness, and how does this show up in our Korean and Korean American communities?
It's a very good question. I'm happy to take a stab at it first. I think it begins with what we aspire to as immigrants. We're children of immigrants in the United States. I hear a lot of people saying that a message they heard growing up in America to be successful, to be American, often meant to be white. Rarely did it mean aspire to be Black. And I think there's a very not so subtle message about not liking Blackness. And then the experiences that some Korean American, Korean communities had with customers at their liquor stores, or suffering that they had at the hands of other Black people, Black neighbors, led to a fear. And I don't think we've ever addressed it. It's just when we think of Blackness, we think of fear, dislike, not something you would aspire to or appreciate. And that's been the unspoken or spoken sentiment for a lot of Korean American communities. So I'll start there. It's just never associated with anything positive.
I think one of the things that is also challenging for the conversation is that anti-Blackness also overlaps with the internal colorism in our community, right? So I grew up being told not to sit out in the sun. And the few visits that I took to Korea, my family there encouraged me to carry a parasol to avoid the sun, to cover up, because of the colorism and the association with a lower class having darker skin, which overlaps and intersects with the anti-Blackness that we are talking about specifically in the context of the Western construct, or the US, and particularly kind of the time that we have and that we're in right now. The anti-Blackness that is very specifically directed at the African American community, and how there are so many historical points that I think for me, as not quite solidly a second gen, is really hard to make sense of, right? There's the colorism, but then there's the exportation of racism with military presence in Korea and how that plays out on military bases and then goes out into the communities there in Korea. So I think there's a lot there that we need to be aware of when we specifically as Koreans and Korean Americans are talking about anti-Blackness.
I think on a personal, like on an individual level, it's helpful to understand anti-Blackness as a form of like suspicion and skepticism towards one group over another group. Regardless of the experiences that people have, it seems like, when you arrive in the United States, or when you start hearing the stories of the different racial groups, you automatically, we tend to have this natural suspicion towards Black people in a way that we don't have towards white people. And I think that is at the heart, in some ways, of anti-Blackness, which leads to fear. And a lot of it is due to like understandable, personal, real experiences. But oftentimes these real experiences are not tied to an understanding of the broader historical and contextual framework that lead to these things. And so I would say that if you have a suspicion of one group over another group, simply because of their skin, like, and I would venture to guess that, you would have that towards Black people more than you would towards white people. You wouldn't lock your door as soon as you saw a white person, but you might if you saw a Black person, or you might clench your purse if you saw a Black person, but you might not if you were with a white person. Or you might be in a store and you might feel comfortable leaving your computer or your cell phone on the table and go to the bathroom and come back if you're in a white coffee shop or store, but not in a Black coffee shop or store. There's more than just a kind of like I'm operating out of my personal experiences type of motivation there. There's a deep racialization where you're more suspicious of people based on particular color. And so I would say, you know, that is kind of how you can define whether you have anti-Black sentiments or not.
And if we're honest, it happened well before immigration to the United States, right? We have to think about colorism from Korea. How maybe Koreans, as we like to say, Korean nationals, may look at people from Africa, for example, or anyone who lives in Korea who's darker. So it's not like it started in the United States, and I think it's a mistake for us to think that this was just a US problem. We have a lot of racism in Korea as well. I mean, if we're honest, we were asked to mix in a little bit of Korean, so I will. 솔직히 말하자면 우리 한국 사람들 서로 차별하지 않아요? 한국 사람들끼리 서울에서 안 온 사람들, 뭐 시골에서 온 사람들, 조금 더 까만 사람들. You know, these are all examples of colorism that we have and sort of dislike for each other. I think every group has that. So we have challenges within our own communities. So let alone when we start talking about other communities like the Black community.
And Alex, I think it's so important to think about the psychology behind why things might be. So for example, you know we come from a war-torn, poverty-stricken little peninsula, always, being controlled by greater powers that be. And I think what that does to someone's psychology is you want to defend and you want to protect. And so I think at one point, it may have served Koreans well to actually close our doors to, anything that was not us, because again, people were trying to take over us and colonize us. And yet times have changed and the context has changed. And I think those habits have become so ingrained that now it's so difficult to change. And you talked about it a little bit, like the colorisms that exist in the US or in Korea. In some ways, 한번 생각해보세요. 백인의 반대는 흑인이에요, right? That's the opposite of white. Being Black is the opposite of white. And as immigrants, we all go through a racial identity where we want to be nothing but white. And so we don't want to be anything that's the opposite of that. And I think that plays a little bit into it. I think it also has a lot to do with how the US, maybe they never colonized us, right? And yet the imperialism, when it comes to economy, when it comes to policies, when it comes to political powers, white supremacy has always existed in Korea. And so it's not surprising we have so much anti-Blackness.
Yeah, and I think Pastor Ray touched on it a little bit, but it's not just conscious thoughts, right? Like it's in our unconscious. And the examples he gave of locking your doors when a Black person was walking by, or even moving your purse over in the grocery store from if a person is walking on the other side of the aisle. I think these things, as kids, we watch our parents do it too. We see people in our community behaving a certain way and we internalize it. And though they may stem from a place of wanting to protect ourselves, these messages, these subliminal messages that we are receiving, and actually not so subliminal too, very explicit messages we're receiving about Black people, they frame the way that our biology even is shaped, right? When you see a group of Black people, sometimes even before you have a conscious thought, your nervous system may react first and you may feel anxiety. And I think that is a really important part of anti-Blackness and a reason why all of us have to acknowledge it and all of us have to talk about it, because I don't know if anyone has been unscathed by anti-Blackness.
So I want to affirm that I see our questions and we're going to address those. Some of them in the upcoming questions, particularly about trauma and how do we deal with the past. So I'm not ignoring you. I see those and we'll get to those. So I want to move on to the next question. Let's talk about history, historical context. What are the roots of anti-Blackness we see within the Korean and Korean American community? How did it come about? And how is it being perpetuated?
I mean, there's so many I think that's what's so challenging about this is that there's the history in Korea, and then there's history here in the US, and some of it overlaps and some of it doesn't. And then some of our parents came earlier, so it's impacted more directly, and some of it is not. And I think that's what is so important, is that I'm still learning. I'm still learning. So I had brought up the US militarization and the war, and I do think that there is a huge impact on the psyche of a people who saw in one generation the US being the saviors, the ones who came to their aid, and then the younger generation who stayed in Korea seeing the US as imperialists and colonizers, right? There are still protests demanding the demilitarization of the peninsula. And my parents are not of that generation because they left. So I think that that is part, if our parents came at a time where their impression of the US was favorable, and that impression were white soldiers came, then that connects with a sense of being American is being white. And then the colorism then kind of confuses that. I would say that impacts women in different ways. So let's just add the confusion and the complexity in that. And we see that there in Korea, right? And the exportation of like K-pop. The whiteness, right? The whitening products, the surgery that is done that they swear they haven't done, right? All of that is part of the anti-Blackness and the colorism and the pro-Western in the framework of whiteness. So I think those are some of the things that I'm still wrestling with and unclear how to fully engage with my parents who had a favorable impression of the US when they came. I don't know about the rest of you.
That's good. Yeah, the anti-Blackness is as much rooted in pro-whiteness, as Kathy's alluding to, which is really important for us to talk about, why we value so much whiteness, even physically whiteness in Korea, and why Blackness is looked down upon. So that's an element of it. I take it back to sort of the perceptions that people have of Africa. And it's associated with always being associated with poverty, underdevelopment. And so the association you have with people from Africa who are Black, by and large, we associate negatively. So there's that. One thought I have about how it's sort of the modern version, the modern history of anti-Blackness could be rooted in our own capitalistic and materialistic nature of competition. Came here, suffered, went to, some generations, this is true. You went to good schools in Korea, good universities, Skyhaekyo, and then you came to the United States and you worked terrible jobs, understandably, like a liquor store or grocery store or something like that. And it's not what you wanted, but you wanted what's best for your children. And we applaud that in our parents. Did everything you needed to, and it was competition. You had no time to think about others because we had to take care of our own children to get them into good schools, get good homes. I understand all of that. But what was missing, fundamentally what was missing, is care for others. And if you're a Christian, I think we understand the Bible says to love your neighbors as yourselves. And we were busy loving ourselves, making money. Oftentimes making money off of Black communities. It doesn't matter how nice we were to our customers if all we're doing is selling alcohol to a community, but not living in the community. This is this is hard conversations, but 1992 riots, that was the biggest complaint among Black communities to us Korean Americans. You don't live here, all you do is sell us alcohol, but you live in the suburbs. drive nice cars, live in nice homes, and your kids go to good schools. And it's all of our money that you sold to us, liquor. So that's something that we should explore as well.
So I want to ask the last part, and Dr. Gunn, Alex said, you know, the liquor stores and kind of the conflict. But are there other ways this is being perpetuated now, this anti-Blackness? Can we think of other examples?
I mean, I do want to kind of go back a little bit and highlight what Josephine or Dr. Joe said. There is something about the colonization and the imminent threat of colonialism that probably shaped our social imagination in ways that helped us buy into white supremacy. I still remember stories of like my aunts and my grandparents saying, man, they loved it when, for example, and this was after, you know, we were colonized, but they loved it when the white military officer would give them a piece of chocolate. Like it just brought them to, it just brought them excitement, and they were thrilled. But I think that for a small country like ours, when we were threatened under colonialism, and we saw that the imperial powers of the Western world, which is predominantly white, was taking over, and the ways that they were deeply, they were utilizing people from Africa to be their slaves. In our imagination, we automatically put whites at the top and then blacks at the bottom. And our society was never diverse in Korea to actually cultivate meaningful relationships with Black community members. And so that hierarchy was never challenged or questioned, and that remained all the way through, regardless of whether they stayed there or whether they didn't. And I see it even today where, like if my friends had taught English in Korea, if they were Black, man, you could almost every day expect that they would experience some form of microaggression. But of course, they had a higher tolerance for it because they expected to be treated like an extra foreigner, not understanding how deep anti-Blackness sentiment was within the Korean American or the Korean, the first Korean community. But I mean, we see anti-Blackness today, especially in the United States, in the fact that if one of our kids or want to get married to a Black person, that's the last thing that would be accepted within the family or within the home, right? It's like only if you're at a certain age and you've exhausted all your options can that be a real option. But I've heard from almost universally that one of the main things that men and women have heard from their parents is you can bring home almost anybody, you know, because you're more progressive, quote unquote, just not a Black person. And you have to wrestle with where that comes from.
I just want to add, I don't think any of our, or not any, but most of our parents weren't thinking about all of the intricacies of, you know, white supremacy, being transnational, things like that, when they immigrated here. I think we have to recognize we are players in a much larger game where our parents couldn't buy stores in other neighborhoods, right? For some reason, we all had to buy stores in Black communities. We need to question why. I talked to my mom about this. When she said like she wouldn't want me to marry a Black person, and surprisingly, the reason that she gave was because she says, I know what Black people go through in this country, and your kids will have to go through that too if you marry a Black person. And so I think it's important to keep in mind our parents are sometimes much more aware of the racial dynamics of this country, much more than we realize. And I don't want to excuse any anti-Blackness, but I also want to recognize that it's complex, and I don't want to discredit what our parents are also aware of as well.
That's a good transition, actually. Dr. Joe, do you want to say something else or no?
There's just so much to mention, you know, when we talk about the history of the United States and its presence in Korea. White people came, and if you spoke English, you got better jobs. Again, it's so tightly wound to the economic realities. And also, I think we also have to name, you know, Jeannie, as you're saying, this society has a role for every race to play. And our role is to actually create infighting within the minority groups. And that is the role that was given to us. And we do that by upholding the model minority myth. I don't know about the viewers here, but I spent probably decades making sure I was the minority, the model minority. If I was going to be minority, I was going to be the model minority. And if we don't understand the history of that, then we don't understand that every time we uphold that model, then we're practicing anti-Blackness. And something needs to be said.
Thank you. So Jeannie talked about her parents. So we're going to talk about our parents now, right? So these are difficult conversations. I have my Korean parents, and we know it's hard to talk about difficult things sometimes, all the time. So what's important to keep in mind when we engage in these conversations with our parents, these really difficult conversations?
They did the best they knew. And wherever I am at in my journey, right, what I knew 10 years ago was what I knew 10. But now that I know better and I know different, how will I act and what choices will I make? And so when I engage in these conversations with my parents, and it's hard, it is so hard, I have to remember that they did the best they could with what they knew and understood. Because it wasn't, and a little bit of I don't know if it's so much a push to, Alex, what you had said earlier, but it's the striving for financial stability. Can I condemn my parents for that? I'm not really sure, in the reality of that. And the stability and the opportunities that they want and wanted for us are no different than what any Black community, what any Black parent wants for their children. I think the cost has been high in many respects, right? How many of us we aren't fluent in Korean. And so that is part of what makes it so challenging to have the conversation with our parents, is that we don't have the language. And so we're totally missing each other. So I think that's one of the challenges. That's one of the things that I keep in mind, is that I don't have the ability to completely communicate this with my parents. And that is the price that has been paid in our generation. And that I don't know how to solve that in this conversation, really.
I'm thinking more in the modern context right now, with second and third generation Korean Americans talking to, immigrant parents. A big part of it is empathy. And I want to build on that, what you just said, Kathy. It's so easy to shame everyone, right? To be more woke, and our parents are easy targets. And so to not appreciate the poverty that many left in the 60s and 70s, because South Korea was in no shape to support. So you left and came to the United States, not because you were rich, but because you had to find an opportunity. It was voluntary immigration to some extent, but poverty drove people to come to the United States. And so I think we need to recognize that. And as you said, be thankful for the work that they did do. And then the real challenge becomes the beauty of this is not even about anti-Blackness. At some point, it's the beauty of being able to pick a career that is not a white collar career. Let's say a fireman. You want to be a firefighter. And the immigration stress from that first generation to second, to say, we didn't come all this way and suffer and give up everything so that you can be a firefighter. You should be if we want to do that, we could have stayed in Korea. But we wanted you, and they had a list of things that you could be, and the list was very short. And so we understand that. The other part is empathy. Is Korean, we understand Han. We understand Han. Koreans understand Han. Deep sympathy, suffering and it's trying to communicate that same concept to African American community. What they suffer from is the same thing we suffer from. It's Han.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I think there's two words that come to mind that are in line with what both Kathy and Alex were saying. It's survival and sacrifice. I think our parents' generations did what they needed to do in order to survive and to try to, create a better life for their families and their progeny. But the sacrifices that they went through to make that happen, especially knowingly coming as a minority, and oftentimes not understood and we didn't even have a label, right? I mean, I grew up and nobody even knew what a Korean was in my neighborhood. I was either Chinese or Japanese. And the ways in which our parents have sacrificed for us to be able to get to whatever space that we're in is it came at a tremendous cost to them. I wonder what kind of dreams they would have followed if they had a freeway that they can just run down, and what things that they just had to do in order to just navigate this world that they were in and fulfill their racialized role. But I think those are kind of the two realities. And then if we're in a slightly older generation, we do know that they're coming out of a war-torn environment, and war just destroys lives and societies. And so the fact that they even made it in any way out is remarkable.
So let's talk about some of the trauma then, right? So there are some legitimate pains, particularly with the Black community. I'm thinking about the LA riots as an example. I grew up in Los Angeles. I was in 5th grade. I remember distinctly going to church after the LA riots happened, and everything was burned down in the whole neighborhood except for my church. I don't know what God was trying to tell us there, but the Korean church stood. So how do we engage in these conversations with people, particularly with our parents or with our Koreans and Korean Americans who hold trauma and pain?
Again, I think it's one of these situations where we have two seemingly contradicting valid truths, right? Where we have to be able to willingly hold them both. And it's one of those cases. In some ways, 특히 우리 그 1세 부모님들은요, 저희도 마찬가지지만 미국의 역사에 대해서 잘 모르는 상황에서 미국으로 이민은 하시긴 하셨지만 그때 이 조직적인 이런 상황을 전혀 모르셨던 거예요, right? And when you don't know the systemic nature of race in this country, it's so easy to just become very personal and kind of emotional about it. But again, I want to bring it back to the systemic level, right? So even the LA riots, hate to say this, but I was starting college then, Scott. Just named my age. But I remember when the LA riots were happening, it obviously was a white and Black issue. We can't forget that, right? Yes, things were boiling, and we can't really diminish, I think, the impacts of that, right? A Korean store owner literally just kills a 15-year-old. And as a parent thinking about, my gosh, all of the energy and effort we put into our children, and to one day just have their lives taken away, it's just unbelievable. And so all of that pain, talk about trauma, right? And so again, going back to what Dr. John was saying about Koreans being in Black neighborhoods, in some ways, if you look at it, exploiting them for money, right? Because again, whether it's survival or whatnot, this is how they made a living. This Black and white issue, the white cops beat up Rodney King brutally, and then this whole killing of Latasha happens. So then what happens when they are all kind of dismissed? The charges are dismissed. I mean, who wouldn't be angry about that? Again, Alex, you talked about this Han. I mean, we know what Han is because Japan colonized us for 35 years. And in fact, we would be lying if we were to say none of us are impacted by that right now. We're sitting with that trauma right now. It's been passed on, intergenerationally. 세대에서 계속 흘러가고 있는 게 그게 바로 트라우마인데, 흑인들은 그때 그 굉장히 심각한 한국인이 자기네 아이를 죽인 그 사건과 그리고 자기네 흑인 또 다른 흑인 형제가 백인들 그 경찰한테 그렇게 심하게 당했는데 다 they walked free. So imagine for a minute what that must feel like. And really, if you think about it, you know, back in the 60s was the civil rights movement where lots of rioting and all of these things were happening. And then the LA riots were in the 90s. And now in the 2020s, it's almost like 30 years. I need to do a study about this, but it's almost like 30 years is the tipping point. It is as far as I can take in some ways, right? And, you know, what do other activists say? If going by the rules and being subservient and doing these things still don't bring you change, what other thing can you do? Honestly, what else can you do?
And in fairness, this is, I mean, it's easy to blame white people in this, and I won't hesitate to do so. If you think about the opportunities that were not available to Korean Americans in particular, because we weren't allowed in the country until 1965, right? We were one of those countries that was not on the list unless you were the intelligence communities had access. Maybe the academic folks were able to come early, but we weren't here for that fight. So our discussion really seems to have started in the 90s, at least in terms of like the racial conflict. But you know, the other piece is, you know, multiculturalism in Korean 다문화. 다문화는 미국에서만 그런 다문화에 대한 얘기를 하는 건 아니에요. 한국에서도 많이 하고 있잖아요. It's not just a US issue anymore. It's in Korea, we're talking about multiculturalism. The other piece that I want to say, that living in America and living the American dream is incomplete because we only thought about financial and material wealth. Truly American might be, this is the rhetoric, but it might be civic engagement and care for others. That means to be truly American, we start caring for our American neighbors in ways we never have before. The greatest blessing, perhaps, of coming to the United States is to be able to be civically engaged with all of our neighbors, not just make money and live a nice community. I'm not against making money, but that can't be the only thing that drives immigration to the United States. The beauty will be in reaching out to our neighbors and caring for people. It's the most American thing that you can do, is to care for each other. It's the most Christian thing we can do. So there are two good reasons for us to do it.
Okay, let's talk about the church then. So we've given some historical context. We've acknowledged the pain and the trauma and the difficult pain that we carry. Let's talk about the church, particularly the Korean American Church and Korean American ministries. And how do we engage this topic as a church, especially with Korean ministries, usually compromise the first-gen immigrants? And I want to give this context that the Korean church is a very powerful thing amongst Korean immigrants. And so I remember growing up in the church, and this is a small example, but our church pastor said, Halloween is bad. So all of a sudden, before Halloween came, I was like 12, and they're like, we're not doing Halloween anymore. It's of the devil. And so then I was like, that's it? There's no conversation? We're like, okay, right? And that's just a small example of like the Korean pastors and Korean ministry have so much influence over the Korean American and Korean community in the United States. So like, let's talk about this. How does the church engage in something that's a lot more serious than obviously me not getting trick-or-treat candy, right?
I think we have to understand that the church serves several functions. It's not just a vehicle for evangelism and discipleship. It's also a vehicle for community, trading, working together, finding connection, figuring out who you can work with, vendors, customers, especially for Korean Americans who's, as they enter into this capitalistic system. Right? And so we can't think that it's just one or the other. and we have to hold on to that reality. But I do think that within the church, we have to figure out the tension between the aspects of our own kind of community, our inward-facing kind of insular mentality to preserve our culture that we're trying to preserve, and then in what ways we engage with the broader society. I think we've done a far better job of doing the preservation side, which is why, a lot of even second, third generation Koreans, whether they speak Korean or not, still have deeply ingrained cultural values that they operate with, deference towards elders, not pointing with their feet, not stepping over people, waiting till, even a lot of times waiting till the oldest person eats first. Those are things that are ingrained within a lot of second generation, third generation Korean Americans, whether they know it or not, because it's been enculturated through their church experience, church life. But we've not done the best job because the church has primarily been an escape from the Monday through Saturday on their Sundays, so that they can kind of recharge and refuel and reconnect with people who share their kind of cultural and collective experiences. So I think I have a deep empathy for that and a deep understanding towards that. But I don't think that we're moving in any direction of healing or bringing about the reconciliation of Christ in doing what we've always done, right? In being the community center, in being like the stock exchange or whatever we want to call it, that hasn't led to the type of healing that our society needs, and that Korean Americans and that Korean immigrants can actually bring to the table. And so I think a part of that is going to emerge when relationships are built. I mean, we always talk about like how your friendships actually shape you. But I've talked to pastors who've said things like, I had anti-Black sentiments until my tutor was a Black tutor. And I learned that they're actually really nice people. They're kind. They don't fall into the stereotypical tropes that I thought that they had to fall into, because I actually developed a relationship with them. And then there's plenty of opportunities to do like kind of cross ministry service, where you find things that you have common causes that you can kind of get around. And because a lot of the first generation Korean churches have English speaking people, they can do the translation and the bridge building between the two communities. And then even like this is a perfect example. We have a translation that's going on as we're speaking to connect with the first generation community. And so I think that we have to develop relationships, and we have to actually focus and see whether our practices are in line with the mission of God. And if it's not aligned with the mission of God, maybe there's some things that we need to adjust.
I would say a lot of it is our disposition, the way we view Black Christians even, and Black people again in the church. We only see, when we think of Black, and this is no different perhaps than the white church, we go to short-term missions to Africa. We do missions in Africa, but we don't do any sort of local missions to our communities. So there's a disconnect there. 단기 선교는 꼭 아프리카로만 가요. 옆집에 가면 되는데 옆집은 안 가고 아프리카만 가요. 돈도 더 내고 더 멀고. But I think part of that is we feel like that is more like missions. And so that's the same problem I think that we embrace in most North Americans will embrace. The other part is when we invite a speaker into the church, again, we're so caught up with having maybe a guest speaker will not be a Black person. Because I don't think in the church we necessarily think that we're going to learn from Black people. We associate Blackness and Black people with charity, but not we're going to learn from them. So our posture is already, our racism and anti-Blackness has impacted our theology. When in fact, I think the immigrant Korean church has a lot to learn and has a lot of similarity with the Black church. The theology of suffering. 우리 한국 커뮤니티하고 흑인 커뮤니티하고 공통점은 고생은 서로 잘 알아요. 고생이 많았으니까. 교회에서 고생이 많았으니까. 근데 서로 배울 게 많은데 we are always looking to the Americans, which is the white church, to learn. Rarely do we think it's another group. So that's something that we need to wrestle with our own theology.
And
So
I think, real quick,
go
real
ahead.
quick,
Yep,
is that engaging in especially the Korean ministries, and then thinking about what is happening with the second gen and second gen ministries leaving the first gen church and second gen leaving church, period. So there is this seminal piece from, I think, 1980s, late 80s, early 90s, Helen Lee, The Silent Exodus, Asian Americans leaving the church, and how applicable and important that is for us broadly as we take on that political, socio-political term of Asian Americans, but specifically for Korean Americans, how we have left the immigrant church and who leaves the immigrant church and why. So I would say for me as a Korean American woman, leaving the immigrant church was the only way to develop leadership and then be able to speak and learn about these issues around anti-Blackness, around civil rights, around ethnic identity, and then trying to find a re-entry point into the Korean American church. I think those are some of the other dynamics that we need to understand, and that many of our first gen churches were in communities that were much more diverse. And then we left. We left the Black community. Maybe our stores remained, but our churches moved out of the buildings that we once were in and found buildings to rent, and then eventually either take over or build. And in that, I think our theology, I would argue, became whiter. And it assimilated. And then those pastors raised pastors to go where? To the best white seminaries to learn that theology. So I think there is that dynamic. And how might we enter in and say, maybe we don't need that theology anymore.
좀 대화를 많이 하시고 공부를 좀 했으면 좋겠어요. You know, every one of us, we need to study more. I mean, if we look back into history, we really owe a lot to African Americans. I mean, we would not have citizenship rights. We wouldn't be voting. We wouldn't be doing so many things. We literally have kind of stood on their shoulders, and we need to, I think, recognize and acknowledge that. And then, you know, 일세분들 여기, you know, I'm so proud of the Korean parents, honestly. I've seen them, when it comes to social emotional things with their children, I've seen them make leaps and bounds, right? And a big part of that was because we were talking, we're bringing in educators. We constantly put it in the forefront of our minds to think about, don't call your child 망할놈, you know, don't call them like, you know, 썩을놈 anymore, right? And we don't see that as often. And again, it's because we've changed. Because it's through education, it's through talking about it. 엄마, when you do that, this is how I feel, right? And having these types of conversations and being very open. And going back to the two things that I really do feel like we share with the Black community, which is that Han, like this angsty anger and anxiety and fear and everything all rolled up into one. And then this notion of 정. Black people have 정. I don't know if you've noticed it. Right? They share our love for food. They share love for relationships. Once you become family, you're family, right? Doesn't matter what kind of background you're coming from. And so if we can really kind of, I think, yeah, get the 정 going. Again, relationships, that's the only way we're going to learn about people. For those of us who are having conversations with our parents, and if you've never had a Black friend that you could have introduced to your parents, then guess what? That in itself is going to do so much more, taking stock of the people that you have relationships with. Who are you inviting into your homes, right? What kinds of pictures are we showing to our kids even for the next generation? right? Pictures as in like what kinds of scenes do they see with their parents? Do they see all sorts of people being invited to their home and sharing food together and praying and, fellowshipping? In some ways, that speaks way louder probably than anything else.
So we have a lot of Q&A, so I'm gonna jump into that. The first one is thoughts on how churches can address many of the first generation immigrant frustrations and anger over their own hurts and experiences with the Black community while trying to lift up how important it is to stand in solidarity with the Black community. So Dr. Joe just kind of talked about that, but can we talk about that more? Like this commonalities that we have, let's talk about those things.
I was actually on the phone with some churches today, trying to work through some of the things that are going on, and this is the tension that we're experiencing. We're talking about potentially marching together, but they don't want their community to the elderly people in their community who have had only negative experiences with the African American community, and no education around it or no change around it, to see them as basically betraying their own kind, right? They don't want to see the younger generation betraying the older generations who've seen nothing but negative things. And so one of the conversations we've been having is like, okay, so what can we do then? And I think a part of it is going back to finding ways to create proximity between people. I think I heard someone say that proximity breeds empathy, and I think that's true. Because I think once you start getting in each other's faces, once you start sharing meals with each other, once you start praying with each other, once you start serving with each other, it's really hard to hold negative views towards people that that you're in the trenches with, that you're doing life with, especially if they prove you wrong and they prove the stereotypes wrong. And so I think for churches, I think finding ways to serve together is going to be critical, because especially because the language barrier, service is something that's a part of both the Korean American church and the Black church, right? It's like small groups aren't really a part of the Black church experience, and maybe regional groups are, the Kuyakebes, but mostly because they needed a watering hole in the middle of the week to get together and to find community. And we all know that a lot of us were driving like an hour or 2 hours to get to our churches when we were growing up, right? Because that was like one of the only churches that we could go to. And so finding ways to do meaningful service with one another, I think would be game changing. If they saw, if first generation immigrants, especially from the elderly generation, saw someone from the African American community, helping with their trash cleanup or serving meals or engaging in some sort of tutoring or whatnot, I think that would be a game changer. And then obviously building relationships that last. I think what Alex said earlier about preaching, like if they see someone preaching God's word faithfully and passionately, they're gonna be like, I can't not trust that guy because he's bringing or that woman because he's bringing the word. And so I think that would be helpful as well. And then even having panel discussions, where the Koreans go to the Black church and then the Black African Americans come to the Korean church could be powerful.
I think when it comes to trauma and hurts, one of the first things we have to do is we have to validate that, and we have to really kind of sit with the pain with them, I think. We all have a mental capacity of how much we can take, and when trauma and when hurts are overtaking that capacity, there really isn't room for forgiveness and reconciliation sometimes. And so if you're the one on the side of listening to the pain and the trauma, I think one of the best things and first things we can do is validate it and say, that is terrible. I'm thinking of right now a former student whose parents' small business was just looted and just completely demolished. And at that point, if you're in that situation, it's very difficult to say, but still you need to think about, right? And so really taking plenty of time and ample opportunity, I think, to sit with them and stand with them in the pain, to acknowledge it, to validate it and say, of course, this is terrible. It should not have happened to you. And then if there tends to be a little bit more capacity, then I would encourage people to, again, think of it from a systemic perspective, to view perhaps the African American who did this to your store. Yes, this should not have happened, and that's a terrible thing. And also being able to place this person in a larger system that definitely impacted this person in a very specific way, right? And being able to, again, hold both of those things, even though they seem so contradicting, they're actually not. But being able to, I think, really hold both of those things.
I think you brought up looting and damage to the property and all of that, and I think it's worth addressing. Part of it is, I think, our own media, Korean language media, what gets played up, because we're very insular in that regard. What's happening to us, our community, only. And we don't ask the equally important question, why did this happen? We only talk about what's happened, and so then you naturally focus on the rioting, the looting, and destruction of property, but we don't ask why. And Joe, you were getting to this, the broader systemic issues that causes people to take to the streets to really stress their lives. And then this is the hardest part, I think, because it's happening to our own communities and people we know. It's not an equivalent pain. We have to recognize that. Livelihood, business is ruined, and you have to start, we didn't have insurance, all of that, I get it. Does that compare with the death of Black children, boys and girls, men and women? That just doesn't happen to us. And so we have to go back to, we can rebuild and start over. It's hard, we recognize that, but we're not dying every day in the streets. So I think there's a piece there that we have to hold in tension. It's not discrediting the pain of our Korean American community. It's not discrediting your pain, but it's also empathizing with others' pain. And I think that's what we need to hold in tension. And it's not an equivalent. You can, how are you going to say to an African American who is worried about their lives and their children's lives in everyday activity and say, yeah, my business was ruined and I had to start over. So we're the same. Our pain is the same. I'm sorry, our pain is not the same. The other part that I think we need to be careful, and I'm so glad we're having this conversation with just us. 우리 한국 사람들끼리 이런 그 단합회가 중요한 것 같아요. 대화를 더 많이 해야 될 것 같아요. We have to talk with each other more. This is a good start, and I'm so glad we're doing it. I am a little bit uncomfortable if we were starting to invite our Black friends into that space, because they then have to suffer again. And we are going to have to learn, and our families and our communities are going to have to learn at their expense. And so we want to be very careful in how we use our Black friends into spaces, just so that we could learn. So that's something that I want to be cautious of. More conversation with ourselves before we start inviting others in, I think, would be important to remember.
Okay, so let's move on to, it's referring to the church as well. I've seen a few Korean American churches put out statements addressing racial injustice. And although great, it's quite a bit vague in terms of wording. It's not explicitly mentioning Black communities, etc. It feels like the churches are making a blanket statement and something feels missing. Any thoughts on this from the panelists?
I've been saying this a lot. We as leaders in the church need to begin with repentance. We lead with repentance. And so it's a reflection on sins of commission and sins of omission. And I feel like in many cases for the Korean church, it's a sin of omission. It's a lack of empathy and a lack of care in the midst of suffering, death, and pain. And we just went on about our business. And the COVID-19 anti-racism for Asians, the anti-Asian racism is a good example. more people started to care, generalizing of course, but more Asian American Christians started to care because it was happening to us. And so we can empathize more. But part of I think our statements need to be around not solidarity, but two things for me: repentance and confession that we did not care. We weren't doing anything to help. We were fighting our own battle with whiteness and anti-Asian racism, but honestly, we didn't care. And we ask for forgiveness for that. The second is solidarity comes in the form of not going to Black people, but talking to our own communities and making sure we address anti-Blackness in our own communities. So that, I think those are the two statements I'd love to see with churches.
Yeah, and I think I've been talking to people around me about some of their feelings towards some of the statements that we're seeing. And I think I was really humbled because my initial reaction was also kind of anger and frustration that I wasn't seeing what I thought was right. And so I've been talking to some more wise people that are wiser than me, and they really impressed upon me the need to have relationships with church leadership before stepping in. And saying how you feel and being really invested in that community in order for you to voice what you're feeling. And so I just want to encourage and empower any congregant. I know this is like countercultural, but I want to encourage people to talk to their pastors about what is on their hearts. Because I think everyone is being exposed right now to a lot of information on social media and information about anti-racism. And it's kind of jarring to not see that from the church, to not see that information come from the church as well, and not see that addressed. So even though all our whole lives we were taught to not speak up at church, especially as a woman, I know, and I have experiences of feeling pushback. But I want to just affirm that it's good. And I would say pastors that love you would want to hear that from you too, would want to hear what's on your heart and what you want to learn more about. So yeah, I think this is like, I saw something going around where it said, if congregants don't get it from the church, they're gonna go somewhere else to learn about it, right? And so especially I'm in the South, right? I'm in Texas, right? And I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, and this is not a conversation that we have ever. And if you look at the Southern Baptist Church's statement, it can bring up a lot of emotions. And so I think we have to name the complicity, like the church's complicity in all of this, especially some denominations, I don't want to say, but we have to name how we've been a part of it too, and repent, like Dr. Alex was saying.
We have to also remember that statements are well and good, but at the end, what specific actions is the church going to take within the church community, and then within the community our churches sit in, right? So not just from whatever suburb or city you are, the church building is at, that you drive to, but then where, as we, the body of Christ, where we go to, what will we do? And, you know, was it just last week? Time is still kind of melding together, but on Instagram, people were, you know, posting the blackout square in solidarity with Black Lives Matter to elevate Black voices. And that doesn't mean anything unless that's all you're going to do for a week. It really doesn't. And what I've learned over the years is that statements can cause a lot of energy and catalyze people for a moment. But if you do not have a plan for action, it doesn't matter. So I would say for those of us who are wrestling with the statements that our individual churches may have made or our denominations may have made that aren't strong, I get it. And I wish that they were stronger. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. unless there's actually substance and relationship and action tied behind those words. And kind of going back to something that Ray had mentioned, and the idea and the importance of empathy is that we don't want our churches to continue doing charity work, right? The African American community isn't there for our charity. It is there for collaboration, and it is there to teach us about the American church. Because I believe as Korean Americans, like we should know, we have not been here for very long. And so our history is very limited. Yes, there were Koreans who came earlier, but by and large, our families came because of a switch and change in immigration policy that actually the policymakers were not thinking about us. It was like our coming was accidental, and they were like, oh, whoops, bunch of Asians came in. So we need to understand that empathy is not charity. And that can we as Koreans and Korean Americans sit in a place of learning from the Black church, because they have so much to teach us about what it means to be American, the very thing that I think so many of our parents have wanted for us is a sense of place. And I think that is also extremely important for us to understand, that ties into some of the questions that I've seen around civic engagement, is that I think that's the place where many of us feel a little unrooted, is that we are forever the foreigner, and that desire to be American has been associated with being white. But when I think about Americans who have fought, lived in faith, it is Black Americans, not white Americans, Black Americans whose church history and faith is rooted in a place that I think, as one who grew up not wanting to go to all of those church meetings and early prayer meetings, also speaks to my heart in a way where that Jong, right, connects, is that those are the languages that transcend English. And that's where I think our church and our place as Christians, I think we need to learn. We need to humble ourselves.
I mean, I hate to say it, but you know, the missions in Korea, it very much was a charity case, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
what we know of missions and what we've seen from missionaries really kind of modeled what we're trying to do, which is to save people and you know, bestow charity upon them. But going back to this question, I also want to assume that there's a genuine stance of unknowing sometimes. So maybe the church wants to put out something, feels like it should, and gets a stirring in the heart and is really convicted, and yet maybe just is not very good at understanding history or just knowing what to say. And so at those moments, I do think we need to validate that, yes, this attempt was really great. You tried it. At least there's somewhere in the heart that wants to get at this. So honestly, if you see a great example of a letter, then I would forward that to the pastor and also say, you know, all these companies are creating these diversity teams. Maybe our church needs one where you actually don't do this alone, but in partnership with other people in the church can actually make it a very valuable part of the church, right?
I was going to say the example, Scott, you started with the highway, right? This is the danger, I think, is trying to out-woke one another in this work for people. There's no arrival point of wokeness. Everybody learns. I think we've said that a few times in this, but the highway analogy is beautiful, because if you're in the fast lane and you've been going for a while and you're an experienced driver, it doesn't help anyone who just got on the on-ramp and is learning tentatively to how to stay on this road, to shame them, to say, 55, you're going 55, you don't even know how to, look what I can do. Doesn't help the person who, they're gonna gun right off, they're gonna get off the freeway. Because they're like, it was dangerous, that freeway, people were mean. So it doesn't help us recognize that there are multiple lanes. And you can stay in the fast lane with the big people, that's fine. But know that there's space for people as they're just getting on the on-ramp, that they don't get off because they're worried about the other drivers who are driving faster than them. So in light of these statements that churches are making, I want to encourage them. You know, it's a church group here. So it's kind of like, the statement is kind of like the visitor information card. Maybe I'll fill it out, make myself public, maybe not. As soon as you do, now you got them. You know that they're a little bit more interested, a little more committed. Collect those cards and then say, hey, how can I help you? How can I help you to grow? Turn the moment into a movement. So it's not simply one and done. And so, you know, I want to be careful and balanced, if at all possible, to try to get people who've just started. I used to, you know, mock people who posted something on Facebook. I'm like, that's not activism, except for if you've never done it before. And this is the first time you've actually put like Black Lives Matter on your Facebook post and you took a hit. I've seen friends taking a hit for it. And I want to cultivate that for Korean Americans or Asian Americans who are just getting into it. I'm like, okay, that's a start. It's not the end, it's the beginning. And there's so much more waiting for us. And so I think that's the spirit of discipleship. That's the spirit of cultivating deeper relationships with people who are just starting to get on board.
That's great. Thanks, Alex. So I want to get to this one. It says, I've been finding myself feeling tension of not knowing my place. I'm not Black, I'm not white. This discussion has been focused on Black and white conversations. I've had white friends coming to me as their only people of color friend and willing to educate, but also feeling exhausted by it. Feeling guilty about feeling exhausted since I don't experience racism as a Black person would. So where is my place as an Asian American who feels pulled from both sides?
I'll just jump in real quick. I think I talk too much. I've been getting lots of phone calls from lots of people, Asian Americans, white, and I gladly will take the calls if it saves one of my Black colleagues from having these conversations. So in that sense, it's a form of solidarity that I've been trying to understand, to say, yeah, call me, don't call so-and-so. And I'm happy to have that conversation with you. So in that sense, we're standing in the gap. I think it could be positive, but I recognize how tiring that can be, as the person mentioned.
I think we also have to remember that this is something that is going to require the long haul look, right? It's a marathon, not a sprint. And even breaking it down, maybe it's a relay race and you're not in it alone. So I do want to encourage those of you who are really exhausted. I know that feeling. I've taken days off of social media. People have wondered where I went, you know, things like that. I do think that it is important for our mental health to do the things that we need to do to care for ourselves so that we can still remain in community in healthy ways. So, and I do think that one of the things that I did not learn, because I also believe that my parents didn't feel like they had the luxury, is to take rest and to say, I don't know. Because I do think that there are things that in this conversation, we don't know. How can we know as Korean Americans when so many of us actually don't know our own history, right? We don't know how the immigration policies were formed and shaped that allowed our families to come to the US. Those things have implications. We know more about the civil rights movement than we do about how our families came to be here in the US. And so I do think that we are not Black, and we need to remember we are not white. We are not white. And so I do think that that's how you enter into the conversation and say, well, I don't actually have an answer because I am not either. But if you want to get more complex in the conversation, I'm happy to jump in. I'm happy to talk about the anti-Blackness in my Korean American community. I'm happy to talk about the ways in which I heard store owner families talk about Black people. I'm happy to talk about those things, but what I can't talk about is what white people are feeling or what Black people are feeling. I don't know those things. To be honest with ourselves, I think is one of the gifts that we can give ourselves and model for this generation, is to say, I don't know. Maybe this is not the lane for me. Maybe the lane is actually addressing the anti-Blackness in our communities.
I mean, I think you're feeling what this society wanted you to feel. That ambiguity, like, where do I belong? You know, am I a person of color? Am I not? And so I want to recognize that that is definitely in your question, but this is also a very counselor response. You know, as Korean Americans and Koreans, we're just not very good at setting boundaries sometimes. And so don't feel like you have to be available 24/7 for these conversations. If they really want to tap into your knowledge and wisdom, maybe you set a time, maybe once a week, where you have a book club. And I enjoy book clubs because you're now taking content that everybody is getting access to, and then you can bring your own pieces to it. And we're living in a day and age where you really don't have to be the only source of knowledge or validation or normalization or any of those things. And so I would outsource them out as much as you can, and then give them the privilege of meeting with you maybe once a week, maybe once a month. I don't know, but set some boundaries.
Yeah, I think you belong in the conversation. Yeah, so it's like you're not excluded from the conversation, and I think what Joe said is exactly right. The fact that you're even asking that question is a byproduct of the ways in which Asian Americans have been racialized, right? That we don't fit within a black and white binary. And so, the popular framework that's been going around for the past few years has been around whether you're a racist or an anti-racist. And I think that's a helpful framework to operate, under, that you are doing work to dismantle the systems and the ideologies and the attitudes that perpetuate white supremacy and racism in this country within and then all the way down to your local communities and finding all the places there. But I do think that Asian Americans play a unique role in that we can bring multiple voices together because we've served multiple communities and been a part of multiple communities in both positive and negative ways. And so I don't know if that's helpful, but I think, we are, of all the racial groups, I have a feeling that Asian Americans have the greatest potential to bring everyone to the table and keep them there.
Okay, some more questions here. Panelists' thoughts on the statement, the most important thing to overcome racism is the gospel. Although yes, the gospel is everything, it feels like a bit of a cop-out answer, especially amongst those who grew up in the church.
Well, I guess I'd say, which gospel are we talking about, right? Are we talking about the gospel that says, do we get the ticket to heaven? And then we're good. And can you recite a prayer? And for those of us who, church retreats, say the prayer every summer, just in case. Is that the gospel, or are we talking about, when we pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, right? Is it just about getting to heaven, or is it about actually making an impact here on earth? Yeah, it can be an absolute cop-out. And I think sometimes we need to say that. It's a cop-out. It's using Jesus to go get away from the harder conversations about the bias that we have and the bias that's in our hearts and the bias that we have bought into. But I also, as a Christian, want to say, I'm always sad that it isn't more church leaders, more Christian leaders leading these conversations, and that activism and engagement in systemic change so often does not involve Christians. And so I do think that there are things that we can learn from in the activist world. And why is it that the gospel that we proclaim will change lives actually is not changing lives?
Yeah, I think that there are kind of two sides of the gospel message that get emphasized, and within the Korean and the white churches, it's usually the one about Jesus entering into your hearts, and that's where everything happens, and that's really kind of where the end of the line is, that that Jesus comes into your life, instead of us entering into the life of Christ and us submitting to the kingship of Christ. And so I think both are true, but if we are only emphasizing the first one, as Kathy was talking about, it's a very truncated gospel. It's a limited gospel, and it's not a full gospel. And the thing about what Christ calls us to is to bring about shalom wherever we are, because he dwells within us, and to live out of the ethics of his kingdom, which would be to be anti-racist, which would be to dismantle any form of anti-Blackness that we see. And yet, because they are oftentimes seen as situations out there, or not within our own community, or not situations that we face every single day, a lot of times we just kind of dismiss it as things that we just kind of let fester or tolerate until big moments happen, like the '92 riots, or like the Peter Leon case out in New York, where he shot an African American, a police officer shot an African American, and then the Chinese community used him to basically say, hey, like white police officers get away with this all the time. Why did one of ours have to get away? Why can't one of ours get away with it? And so we have to be asking ourselves constantly, what is God calling us into, and what is God calling us to live into in terms of the kingdom, so that we're being faithful to be his witnesses unto the world.
I think the question itself is problematic, right? Because it sounds like plantation theology. I think slave-owning Christians said the same thing. They said, don't worry about racism, just have the gospel. But racism was embedded in the church. Civil rights didn't just happen. It depends on where you start the story. And if you're not starting at the beginning, where racism is embedded in our theology in America, then you came into the middle of the chapter of a book and talking about something that it doesn't really make sense. And if you want to use all we need is the gospel as our go-to phrase, be consistent. People who are fired up about right to life, which is appropriate, and anti-abortion, the response is that all you need is the gospel. If you get robbed and you want to find justice for the crime, you don't need to go to court. You just need the gospel. Well, it doesn't apply in other contexts. We use it to our advantage when we need it. It's a little bit too selective and inconsistent.
Yeah, let's not forget slavery was rationalized by the scriptures, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I took a class in college called Blacks and Asians, and it was about multi-ethnic coalitions. How do we bring together different communities? And my professor, who is not a Christian, said that the only way to bring together different communities is to have a narrative, an overarching narrative that each community can buy into. And we see it sometimes in history with like San Francisco State University, students there. We'll see it crop up sometimes, but it's hard to find a narrative that really brings together people. And throughout that whole class, I sat there thinking, but doesn't the gospel do that? And so I think for me, it's like the gospel should be the reason why we come together with our Black brothers and sisters and fight for their justice. Yeah.
Okay, I want to ask this question and get to the Black Lives Matter movement. It says, some of my friends and family who live in Korea have been talking about the Black Lives Matter movement in a really negative light, saying these types of things, quote, why are Black protesters looting Korean stores? They should leave minority stores alone. Why should we care about Black people when they're the ones who are the most racist towards us? I hope they follow the Black Lives Movement with Asian Lives Matter, because Asian face a lot of hardship in the US too. I've tried explaining the Black Lives Movement matter to them, but I feel like it's not going anywhere. Do you have any suggestions on how I could continue to converse with them without feeling frustrated and or angry?
I think we're sitting with it because we kind of know the answer. You know, it's again education, and who's going to do that educating for them, you know, taking them back through history and thinking about the whole psychological impacts of what's happened in Korea and the US, and of course the interplay of the both. And I think that's why we were just kind of sitting with the heaviness and the weight of the question. But yeah, I would say, you know, when the recording of this comes out, send it to them as your first step maybe. And yeah, hopefully different perspectives will also help them change their minds. But again, I want to remind all of us, we owe a great deal to the Black community. We would not be enjoying, I think, the privileges that we're enjoying right now had it not been for their sacrifices and the bloodshed. And anybody, I think, who truly understands that history would not be able to say, I think, some of the things that they're saying.
I think one of the, we've talked about this and in the last panel about different media sources that people take on, and we can recognize that media, all media has some type of leaning or some type of bias. And so challenging them on where are you hearing these things, right? Because I've seen news reports of Black stores being looted too. And who are the ones that are being looted? Like, who's looting them? Are Black people looting? Are white people looting? Are Asian people looting? Let's kind of challenge the reports of those things, and the accuracy of those things is kind of one way to combat that and challenge. As well as, I think we've talked about a lot of the history and the context, but within the United States and kind of our history of colonization and indigenous peoples and kind of all of that, to slavery, to then what was continued slavery, but migrant working, and now the police system and jailing and all of that. Those are systemic things that proportionally for Black people have been very high. And the United States would not be in the situation that we are in economically if it wasn't for our Black community and taking advantage of them and killing them and enslaving them and imprisoning them. So I think Alex talked about that, right? Like, how do you compare apples to oranges when the apple is like 100 feet high and the orange is like in the palm of our hand? So I think that's one of the things too, of we need to understand the historical context of things and the systemic things in which that is perpetuated now. So we can talk about pain. I think pain is like what we have, like that's what we have in common, and suffering and all these things. We've talked about these things, but it's learning about what's behind that pain and the suffering. Does anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, just the root of the question is this. I feel like the frustration of having the conversation multiple times and not seeing change. And I think this is my piece on solidarity, that we're in this work together. And it's multiple voices in multiple ways, in multiple times. In Korean, what's the expression? 10번 찍어도 안 넘어가는 나무가 없다. There's no tree that won't fall if you keep chopping away at it, would be the loose translation. I'm not a translator. But I think part of the challenge with that is don't grow tired and don't have expectations that change is going to happen in that one conversation. You're not that good. Nobody is so gifted in communicating that they're going to be able to articulate it in a way you're like, oh, I get it. It's like hearing the gospel. For me, it took years. And I think part of that is our disposition. We have to think of this as seed planting, not just harvesting. We do that with the gospel and sharing and all that too. I heard a missionary say this years ago, Korean missionary, worked for Wycliffe. And he said, you can count the number of seeds in an apple, but you can never count the number of apples in a seed. And if your work is to plant seeds so people can let that germinate and grow and somebody else will water it and all that, you probably heard the equivalent of that Bible study story. Trust that you are planting seeds, and people are it's just going to take a long time for people to get there. It took me a long time to get where I am, and it's going to take me a long time to get farther. So I think that's going to be grace and charity as we have these conversations.
So we're unfortunately running out of time, but I wanted to give the panelists just an opportunity as a final thought or encouragement as we move on. And then we're gonna do another poll and a call to action. So panelists, if you want to say one final piece about kind of our discussion here today.
Well, I kind of said a lot at the end there, so I will just say, Black Lives Matter.
You know, all of this is a process, and I look back on my own process and how much studying and how many hours I've poured into documentaries and reading books and having difficult conversations with all sorts of people. It's that type of work that it requires. And so, again, as we've all been saying, it's such a process, I think, to allow that process, but also to be an active, participant in that process. Don't wait for other people to educate you. There are so many great resources out there. And again, it's one of those things, the more you put into it, the more you get out of it. And so I just want to encourage all of us to just continue in that journey.
Yeah, I want to say to the first generation specifically and to other pastors and leaders that a lot of the values that drive me to be a part of these conversations or to do the work that I'm doing were cultivated by you. Were cultivated by my youth pastor and from seeing my parents serve their community and for seeing them being mad about injustice. I learned this from the first generation. And so I just want to give credit where it's due. The reason why we're so passionate is because of you, seeing the passion inside Koreans, yeah.
I want to encourage all of us to know that we are all human and we're going to make mistakes. We're going to show our bias. We're going to show what we don't know. And I think culturally that's very challenging because many of us grew up feeling like we did not have a lot of space to make mistakes and that the cost was going to be high. So I want to encourage us to continue in a very humble posture. I think at the beginning, it was said that we are learners. So this panel is not a panel of experts, but we are a panel of learners, and we're sharing with all of you what we've learned. I wish, we had more time to talk about the ways in which we failed so that we learned, right? The offensive things that we have done and that we have said, and how we learned in that process. But I will be the first to say I made a lot of mistakes and a lot of things that I look back and go, ooh, yeah, I would not do that one again. And that's how you learn. That's how you learn. We all learned how to walk because we fell a lot. And people still cheered us on. And so as one who is in that in between, my kids are older, I cheer them on when they fail and still talk to them about their failures. And that's hard because that wasn't always modeled. Can we model that also for our first gen, right? Can we show love and respect in the ways that I think are so beautiful in our culture, and then cheer them on in the ways that they are trying?
Yeah, no, what I want to say is pretty much in line with what everyone else is saying. I think, you know, if we fail forward, it's okay. I think it's okay to fail forward, and I think that's the only way to make progress is by failing forward. Just keep taking each step. I think taking the steps are pretty important. And then, you know, there are other resources that are available, and if we can find ways to kind of go alongside of people and walk alongside of people, I think that's where the greatest changes are. Because depending on, no matter where you are, you have people ahead of you and behind you, and the people that are so far ahead are not going to be able to catch the people that are so far behind, because sometimes the language has changed, and so we need people all along the chain in order to kind of lift everyone else up. With that said, I will, because I'm with Asian American Christian Collaborative, I'll send a couple of links in the chat. One is specifically to address Asian American and African American tensions within the United States. It's a 3-part series that we did in conjunction with and in partnership with Be the Bridge, which is a racial reconciliation ministry. And then we're currently in the process of creating a series that you can kind of look to, where we talk, it's called Kairos, and basically we're talking about if, why, and how Korean Americans should engage, Filipino Americans should engage, Chinese American, and then we're going to talk to each of our individual ethnic communities. And so we have pastors from different, from all coasts present. I think with the Korean one, we have a guy named Owen Lee on the East Coast who is friends with Alex Jun. And then on the West Coast, we have Jeanette Oak. And then in the Midwest, we have Steve Lee, who's basically my pastor, or he's the pastor at the church that I attend. And then we have different ones that are different conversations that are going to be taking place for different ethnicities. But the Korean one is one that everyone is certainly invited to participate or hear once it gets released.
Okay, thank you, panelists. So I think a poll is supposed to show up now. You all to commit to something. A tangible action is a way forward for all of us, for our brothers and sisters who are hurting. So I really want to ask for a commitment, because we've had some difficult discussion. I think we've talked about different statements and different rallies and different things like that. But really, to really engage in this difficult conversation and to address anti-Blackness, I feel like we need to do something tangible. So I think that's going on. Can we see the poll results, or is it too quickly? Here we go. Okay, great. Self-awareness. It looks like calling out anti-Blackness, learning more about anti-Blackness. So I thank you for these commitments. So I want to make a closing statement. I want to thank the panelists. This has been such a rich and meaningful conversation. I know I learned a lot from our panelists, and I hope that everyone that has joined has taken away some wisdom and knowledge that they can take and move forward. And I really want to encourage everyone to continue to seek out truth and not let these convictions fade. A lot of us have the benefit of stepping away from these horrible injustices that are occurring and not to think about it. But this is a daily reality for our Black brothers and sisters, and they don't have the luxury to escape or move on from the heaviness, the fear, and the pain. And so as Jesus took on the burden of our sins and transgressions, it is our duty to do the same for our brothers and sisters in Christ. And I want to continue with my analogy that I shared at the beginning. You got on this highway of learning, and I want to encourage you that there are no exit ramps now. We're on the path toward reconciliation. And there may be some rest stops, and if we need a break and we need to take care of ourselves, that's fine. But we need to continue to move forward. And if we really want to do Christ's work, we can't take our foot off the pedal. We need to keep going. So thank you all for joining us. I'm going to pass it back to Kathy, who has a few things to announce as we end our time together. Thank you all for attending.
Great. Thank you so much, Sky. Really, thank you so much, Sky, all our wonderful panelists, our incredible translation team who've been just so hard at work to make sure this conversation is taking place intergenerationally. We're so thankful to all our attendees for joining us for our 2-hour conversation. We know that it's still not enough. And so we want to direct you to let you know that in the chat box right now, you will see a survey link. We are asking for feedback. Obviously, this is the first time we've been doing an online translation to have this important conversation. So if you have more thoughts to that, please fill out that survey for us. We will take that very seriously.
네, 저희 수고해주신 모든 분들께 감사의 말씀을 전해드리고 싶고요. 지금 이 시간에 줌 대화창에 보시면 서베이 링크, 설문조사 링크가 있습니다. 거기 설문조사에 참여해주시면 저희가 더 도움이 되는 웨비나와 다른 자료들을 더 많이 준비할 수 있어서 꼭 참여해주시면 감사드리겠습니다.
And second, we noticed that a lot of people are just wanting resources, which is so exciting for us. We have so much to learn, all of us. And so for those of you who had some resources that you mentioned, right now in the chat box, you also have a resource link where anyone who attended this webinar, including our panelists and our moderator, have access to that document. So we'll include all the resources that we could share broadly so that we can continue to delve into this work together. We'll share that out in an email as a follow-up email after this webinar.
네, 그리고 줌 대화창에 또 보시면 다른 링크가 뜰 겁니다. 거기에는 많은 분들께서 자료를 쉐어하실 수 있는 구글 닥을 액세스할 수 있습니다. 거기에 많은 자료들을 넣으시면 저희가 이 웨비나가 끝난 후에 모든 분들에게 이 구글 닥을 꼭 쉐어하도록 하겠습니다.
And lastly, we just want to mention that this all was put together out of just the heart to serve the Korean American community. MSG is a purely volunteer-run organization. So if you would love to see more platforms like this and more conversations, please join us in these efforts. You can find out more about how to get involved by visiting our website, both in English and Korean, and you'll see a link to that in the chat box below.
네, 마지막으로 줌 대화창에 올라온 또 링크들을 보시면 저희 MSG가 현재 완전히 봉사자들의 수고로 저희가 운영이 되고 있는데요. 만약에 MSG를 후원하실 마음이 있으시다면 저 링크들을 통해 저희 단체를 꼭 후원해 주시길 부탁드리겠습니다.
Thank you so much. We will conclude with some music. Please feel free to click those links, fill out that survey, and we wish you a wonderful rest of the evening or the day wherever you are tuning in from. Thank you so much for joining us.
네, 함께 해주셔서 감사드립니다.
May the grace be with you in all your days. And nights bring blessings in a quiet resting place. May your hearts be stirred with kindness, reaching out for those in need. And though the smoke is ever rising, may you slowly learn to breathe. This world is changing me, but I still love you faithfully. This world is changing me, but I still love you faithfully. So darling, can't you see? I'm trying so hard, I'm trying to be what you see in me. Peace be with you as you feel the coming. May you hear the knocking steps, feeling death could be at the door. May you laugh as you once did, and your your favorite child and memory. May you feel the first glances and every moment's revelry. Won't you feel? Yes, won't you feel? This world is changing me, but I'll still love you faithfully. This world is changing me, but I'll still love you faithfully. So darling, can't you see? I'm trying so hard, I'm trying to be what you see in me. This world is changing me,